So I have a software development background. I've been writing ops automation software for most of my career. As an SRE at Heroku, I never thought I would be debugging relationships, process hacking, using I feel statements. Writing code and designing reliable services is the last thing I do. Why isn't this advanced? Okay. I'm Lex. This is Courtney. We're SREs for Heroku. Heroku is a platform as a service. It's kind of ops as a service. My job is to keep your application running all the time. We do 130,000 requests per second. There is no low part of our traffic graph.
We use something we call the total ownership model, or total service ownership. This was a phrase that I was not familiar with the first time I've heard it, even though I've worked at companies that have used this kind of model before. So I'm going to try to explain what it is that we mean when we're talking about that. When developers are responsible for the operation of their code in a production environment, when the developers are the ones who receive the pages and who receive the consequences of the work that they do, we think of that as a total ownership model. It means that nothing gets pushed off onto another team, and developers are directly in contact with how their work is performing in the real world. In a traditional operations model, you have an organization that looks kind of like this. Companies operate in hierarchies. They disseminate vision and direction from the top. Happy, sunshine, roses. And they attenuate pushback. That's how hierarchies work. That's how organizations work. That's what companies are designed to do. So if you have an operations team between your service and your engineers, it means that the operations team feels the full force of whatever is happening with the surface, but they cannot communicate it effectively to engineering in its entirety. Engineering is insulated from some of those consequences from the back pressure provided by the service, usually in the form of pages. That means that the team that's absorbing all of this has a very limited ability to address problems that they see. Companies have to do this for support, so it seems reasonable to do this for operations, and you could argue about whether companies have to do that for support. Actually, a lot of early stage startups clearly don't, but the situations are not really analogous, and we think you get a much better service if you do the total ownership model. It looks a little bit more like this. When developers get that back pressure personally, they get clear feedback about the changes they've made. Were they good or were they bad? How are customers experiencing what's happening right now? And they are able to more directly advocate with the people who are creating the vision and strategy to not get too behind on technical debt, not deploy things that are going to be super hard to manage in the long term. This is where it's tough to represent what SRE does when you add it to this mix in 2 dimensions. This is a terrible slide. My remediation item for this slide is to go take a data visualization class with Edward Tuffy, because the person that I am today cannot represent this in any more elegant fashion. The way that an ops team can tune a service, an SRE team can tune an org. SRE with a total ownership model changes the interconnections in your org and helps put incentives in the right place. SRE can amplify back pressure provided by the service when needed, bringing the pain of things that we're dealing with right now in the real world to the vision and strategy folks more effectively. They can make successes, failures, and the state of the world more visible. Improve monitoring, improve how the monitoring and alerting is presented to people, improve the discovery of all of those things, make it more clear, more easily to more people what's happening right now. So our team at Heroku has existed for about 2 years. It took us a while to find our place because we weren't doing the traditional ops thing, and we weren't going to be on call for any of the services that are currently in production. We're kind of talking about how that happened for us.
So with a total ownership model in SRE, I can calm the fuck down because I know that the developers have the same motivations that I do. We all want to keep the service running, if only because they don't want to get paged in the middle of the night. The devs also know that they're doing the right thing for the service. They feel more secure in their role. We're all on the same team, reliability. And we ended up with a kind of a shiny, happy people holding hands situation. In the old model, you sort of have a throw it over the wall kind of situation. Ops' job is to say no, or at least that's the job they find themselves in. Dev isn't set up to consider operational concerns. Dev has all these pressures from vision and strategy to get things out the door. Ops has the operational concerns. They want to protect the service, protect their pager burden. Ops distrusts Dev because Dev makes Ops' job more difficult. Dev is the source of the pain. Dev is the source of the paging by not designing a reliable system. So Ops blocks Dev. Oh my gosh, don't ship that thing, please. It's going to make my life hell. Dev gets annoyed because they've got the pressure coming from above, from vision and strategy, saying, ship this thing. So Dev distrusts Ops, and you end up with a natural opposition between Ops and Dev. We've all seen it. So some organizations deal with this by empowering Ops to say no harder. I've seen this a lot of places. It can work, but it makes the opposition much worse. Dev kind of feels like they're being blocked from doing their job. You also end up with a knowledge gap. So there was this time, a job -3, where we acquired a company and Ops ended up inheriting support of their product. And I got paged for it. And this thing was down. It was telling me it was down, so I thought it was probably down. It looked down. But I didn't have a darn clue how to deal with this thing. It was running on some platform it was Heroku. It was running on Heroku. And I didn't know how to use Heroku. So I paged the developer, got nothing. I called the developer, got nothing. Paged and called the rest of the team, nothing, crickets. Paged and called the manager of the team, nothing. Pulled out my org chart. Who's the next person? The vice president. Paged the vice president. Got a hold of the vice president. Hi, this service is down. I can't reach the team. I can't reach the manager. Okay, thanks for letting me know. I appreciate your bringing this to my attention. I think we're going to have to leave that down. So I page the devs, but the devs aren't really on call. Supposedly, in Ops, I am empowered to pull in any resources I need in the company to get the service back up. But in reality, these people might accidentally leave their phones on silent. They don't have a real pager rotation. So Ops is on call with little information and little ability to get that information or to get those people with that information on the scene. So you end up with resentment and panic, all of the responsibility and none of the knowledge. Saying no to block pain in Ops is not scalable the larger your organization gets. If you've got multiple dev teams trying to ship things, you're going to end up with something like this. Dev shows up, dev has something they need to ship. Ops says, hey, this thing looks, so it's not scalable, there's something wrong with it, it's going to make my life more difficult. Stop, whatever you're doing, don't do it. Please don't ship this thing. Dev's like, well, I really need to ship this thing. So, oh, look, here's a PC. I'm going to chuck it on here. Hey, look, it's on the network. We're good to go. We shipped. Yay! All the other dev teams do that, and suddenly you've got poo running on a desktop, a Spark station, and your toaster. So this is a reliability problem. Saying no didn't get you more reliable. It got you less reliable because dev doesn't end run around you. The end result is a less stable infrastructure, even if you're trying to empower Ops to say no harder. So how do we avoid the poo? Don't say no. Even if what you mean is no, say yes if. Yes, we can deploy this thing if we make it more scalable, if we add some redundancy. Avoid negativity because negativity creates opposition. Call out successes when something great does get deployed, when something is really reliable, feeding back into the system. You're feeding positivity in. People will start listening to you more if you're positive and listen to you less if you're negative. Disseminate and encourage best practices. SRE is kind of sitting in the background looking at all of this and attenuating the feedback back and forth. we can tell people, we can help people do the things they're all doing by giving them an idea of best practices. We can alleviate the friction that causes devs to resort to hacks. Don't dictate what should be done. Provide evidence. Win their hearts and minds. And if it doesn't work, you could try to seek buy-in higher up in the org. But you could also just remember that if they ship this thing, they are going to carry the operational burden for it. They're going to get paid for it when it goes down because it's not reliable. And the situation is going to self-correct. That feedback will result in the change you want to see.
So what this means is, for the way that we run SRE, we need a really holistic view. Anything that we can think of that affects reliability is in scope for SRE for us. If you have repeated problems with devs taking down production due to cats walking on their keyboards, you don't just declare that feline error and move on. You need to do something about it. That's the sort of thing that we're talking about, not merely what's wrong with the infrastructure, what's wrong with the monitoring, what's wrong with the alerting, but what's wrong with the environment in which all of this is taking place. When I joined Heroku SRE, I didn't think I would get to work on things like perceived job security, engineer morale, vendor relationships, and work-life balance, but those turn out to be super important to what the team is actually doing now and to what the engineering org appreciates about what we're doing. I've been allowed to fulfill the widest limits of my visions for SRE, and it is so exciting. Shout out to my amazing manager, Joy Sharman. People often ask, both with the total ownership model and with SRE, what about pager fatigue? Pager fatigue is this thing that's going to happen. It's a reliability risk. Tired people make mistakes. We all know that. That's sort of why we're asking this question of each other. But it's also an expected failure mode. It's one of the things that is going to happen when your organization gets to a point in its life where it's running a little too close to the edge. So it's a signal that things need to change. It's not critical yet, right? We're not yet at the point, if we're only talking about pager fatigue, we're not talking about things falling apart yet. We're just talking about people getting tired and getting paged too often and maybe getting paged for things that don't make sense. But that's when the organization can take that as a signal to step back and look at what we're doing and see what we can do better. Because the end state of pager fatigue is burnout. SRE is uniquely placed to catch pager fatigue becoming burnout and to try to stop that process. Once people are talking about burnout, things have been bad for a really long time. Like, people don't get burned out overnight. They don't get burned out in 1 week. What they do get is tired and maybe need to take a day off. Burnout is a process that happens over time with too much work, too much stress, too much engagement, too many hours. So once we're talking about burnout, we've passed all the sort of small to medium signals that something is wrong, and we've gotten to really big ones. That's when we start to see people leaving. That's when we need to take a drastic look at the org and what we're doing and see what we can change.
So how can we make on-call not deadly? SRE ends up being in the position to create best practices not only for our own on-call, but for on-call for all the dev teams. At Heroku, we promote work-life balance because a lack of work-life balance is a reliability risk. So our best practices, what does it look like? We use a primary-secondary system. A couple of talks have already mentioned it. So when you're on primary, that means the pages for your service come into you. You have a secondary who's serving with you for that week. And if you miss a page, it goes to them. Then, after the week is over, you're off the hook, and the secondary becomes primary, and a new secondary joins in, rotate through the team, and eventually your turn will come back up eventually. So some organizations, you're glued to your desk during on-call. You can't leave the house. People feel like they can't go out to dinner, something like that. We promote something a lot more relaxed and a lot more realistic. We say you have your secondary there for a reason. They're not just there to catch extra pages. You can say to your secondary, hey, I'd like to go out and get a coffee real quick with my friend. Do you mind if I swap us primary and secondary, or do you mind if I just turn my phone off? Your secondary is there to back you up and to help make your life not hell. And then your secondary is going to do the same thing for their secondary when they become primary. You need to make sure that there are enough people in the rotation. Nobody gets to duck being on call. Being on call half of your life is way worse than being on call for even slightly less than half of your life. Also, being on call for a certain number of hours out of every 24-hour period, let me tell you, is absolutely horrible. It's much better to get your week done and get it over with. Well, you're 2 weeks since you'd be secondary first. We also, in incident response situations, we recommend and push a 4-hour maximum time for any incident responder. After your 4 hours is up, tag in your secondary. If you're already the secondary, start tagging in other members of your team. Tired engineers make mistakes. They make the incident worse. The incident lasts longer. That's a reliability risk. 4 hours is a figure that we've come up with empirically based on the evidence of our past incident responses. After 4 hours, people just start making mistakes. So burnout is a reliability risk. Burnout leads to attrition. I don't want to have to backfill your ass. You're going to take information with you about how to run this infrastructure. You're going to take a piece of the on-call rotation and increase the burden on everyone else. We all owe it to ourselves, our coworkers, and our companies to avoid burnout. Keeping a system running 24/7 is incredibly stressful, and we often forget that. So we should encourage each other in self-care for the sake of our service that we're trying to keep up. I have a reputation of being annoyingly persistent among my colleagues about telling them to GTFO, stop working for 10-hour shifts. You're not doing anyone a favor. First of all, you're getting tired. You're probably not working your best. Second of all, you're not a hero. You're not magical. You're not going to do anyone any favors if I have to replace you because you leave because you burned out after a year.
Go away and don't check your email.
Yes, don't check your email. You're done for the day. Get out.
So SRE is also the owners of the incident lifecycle process. The product owners, I guess, is how we phrase it internally. We are involved in every incident and every retrospective. So it makes sense that we maintain the protocol that we use to conduct incidents and incident retrospectives. Changes in the process primarily affect us because at each stage we are guiding other people through the incident response protocol. That's kind of what it means to be the incident commander, which is a term that we still use even though we've had some internal discussions about whether it's the right one. The exception to this is when we make changes to when to page SRE. Those changes we socialize aggressively through emails to the organization, checking in with all of the managers, checking in with individual contributors, changing our HipChat status line. And we really work that one pretty hard because that's the one that we can't help. By definition, we're not there yet. We can't help. So the incident lifecycle, right now we consider the incident lifecycle to begin when the impact starts, to proceed through the incident response itself and the retrospective, and to basically end when the remediation items that we come up with in that retrospective are handed off to the teams who need to do the work. There's a bunch of reasons for how we chose the beginning and ending of that process, which are a little bit too much to go into right now, but I can talk about it later if you catch me in the hall. That means that we are setting things like, what are the criteria for an incident? When do we open a public incident? When do we close it? When do we host a retrospective? What does it mean to have a good retrospective? When do we feel like we've really covered all the ground that we need to in having a retrospective? And when was this incident bad enough that we need to post a long-form explanation to our customers of what happened, why we are very sorry, and how we will keep it from happening again?
Okay, so your service goes down. What happens? How does SRE get involved? Well, dev is on the hook for their service, so dev gets paid by the system. We ask that our dev teams get us involved, page us, anytime there is any user impact at all, or there might become user impact, or there might be user impact and I don't know. So our devs will page us in. We have a rotation of our own. And SRE, in turn, will page a member of the support team in, who also has a pager rotation, to do external communication, to post on our status site. So in the incident, the dev actually fixes things. SRE coordinates the incident response as a whole. SRE's responsibility is the holistic platform health, and dev's responsibility is the health of their individual component. SRE's role is incident coordination. A technical background is still vital because we have to understand what's going on. We have to know what dev is doing to fix the problem during the incident, how the systems fit together, how a problem in one service might impact another service. Perhaps we need to bring in another team. And then SRE will coordinate between those two teams. So at, again, job -3, I was on the ops team, and we were on the hook for incident response. We didn't know what we were doing, so we would have to page in devs. So I page in a dev to fix the system. Dev tells me, hey, I've got a fix in place. It's going to take a long time before the fix actually completes. And I say, well, please don't leave the scene here. Internally, I'm thinking, it took me enough work to try to get you out of your bed because you're not on a real pager rotation. So even though you're not actually doing anything right now, I want to hang on to you until you can prove to me that the service is up and running, because I don't know how to run this thing. And if you leave, I'm going to be on the hook again and not know how to do it. So I'm going to hang on to you for dear life. Don't go away. At Heroku, I had to get rid of this habit. I had to remember I can let my devs go back to sleep because the system is going to page them if it goes down again. And even if it doesn't, because of a monitoring gap, I can always page them in because they have a real pager rotation. Letting your devs go back to sleep in the middle of the night helps to prevent burnout. So at Heroku, SRE's role in an incident is the incident commander. This is based on the FEMA disaster response protocol and was explained in excellent detail by Alice, who's in the audience right there, yesterday. A quick recap. The IC does not fix the problem. We are there to have a holistic view of the incident, to understand all the parts of what's going on at a time, and to free devs up to work on their individual part without having to hold context of the entire incident response, especially for large incidents. SRE also identifies the full scope of user impact. Sometimes it can be hard for devs to see beyond their service to what other effects there might be on the users, long and short term. SRE queues up external communications and feeds that user impact to the support team member so that they can write an externally facing message on our status site telling people what's gone wrong and when they can expect an update, when they can expect it to be fixed. The IC coordinates teams of developers that don't work together very often necessarily. They're each going to have their own incident response process. They might even be doing it differently from each other. They're not necessarily going to be used to working with each other. SRE is keeping an eye on what everybody is doing at the same time to prevent duplicate and conflicting work, which can slow down the incident response process and possibly make it even worse. The IC asks questions to understand the full scope of what's going wrong and why we are doing what we're doing. Asking questions is incredibly powerful because it can get the devs thinking, and they might not have realized what you're talking about, and they might see other things they need to do or other things that are wrong. The IC's overall goal is to drive to a resolution of user impact. That means that sometimes a Band-Aid fix is exactly the way you want to go. Engineers, we all feel like we want to fix something the right way. So even if you're up in the middle of the night, 3 a.m., the system is wrong. I want to know, why did this thing go wrong if I'm a developer? What in the world led to this exception happening? Well, I need to point out that we don't necessarily actually need to come to the root cause during the incident. In fact, it's probably not a good idea. If we can just block the user impact long enough to get us to, say, the next workday so that it can be fixed the right way. That's a great solution. That's victory, because user impact is gone and everybody gets to go back to sleep. Out-of-hours work is a reliability risk because everyone is tired. They're going to be more likely to make mistakes. So SRE in the IC role is going to discourage the fix-it-right syndrome and instead make a fix-it-now, but fix it safely. Safe Band-Aids only. Make sure that if you're encouraging a Band-Aid, it's one that's going to last and not result in a repage or a repeat of user impact before the next workday when it can be fixed correctly. As IC, I often find myself managing the people resources around me that are in the middle of incident response. So I'm trying to prevent burnout. The IC will enforce the 4-hour shifts even for the IC role itself. That means that the IC is going to hand off to another IC who's going to take over. The IC is also going to be asking, okay, all of you devs, how long have you been on the incident? Probably actually tracking that on some kind of spreadsheet or something like that. Devs will often want to, well, anyone really, you've got a problem in front of you, you want to fix it, but the longer you go at it, the more likely you are to make a mistake.
Yeah, this is super important. People often overestimate their ability to keep working.
Yeah.
And you feel like you can keep going, but once you actually stop and take a minute, it becomes the impact of what you've done already becomes more clear.
And then you, fall over. I also even find myself asking people, okay, when did you last eat? It can be really easy to forget when you've last eaten. You've been on an incident for hours. You're going to make more mistakes. Okay, so the incident is over. Hooray. Now it's time to look back. Why do we look back? Why do we do a retrospective? The goal is to prevent a recurrence of the problem. We need to get really deep down into what went wrong and make sure it doesn't happen again. Sue from Google really said it well yesterday when she said, if you don't do a retrospective for a given incident, you are accepting that that incident can reoccur. Maybe that's okay for your situation. Maybe you allow that in your service. Most of the services I've worked on, we didn't want to see those incidents happen again because they're painful for our users.
Story time. Seattle has the 2 longest floating bridges in the world. And in 1990, one of them sank over the Thanksgiving weekend in a storm while it was being repurposed. The public reporting on this accident to this day is very simplistic. People say things like, well, if you fill a floating bridge full of water, then it sinks, har har. That's true, but not accurate. The official investigation found that there were 5 factors involved, and all of them were required for the bridge to fail. What they were doing at the time of this failure, they were resurfacing this bridge. They were going to be changing the direction of the traffic on it, so they were scraping off the pavement from the bridge with water, high-pressure water, in order to redo all the lane markings and stuff. They were initially letting this run off into the lake until the EPA noticed and told them, you can't do that. That's, now that's toxic water. You can't just let that go anywhere the hell you want. We need to figure out something to do with it. But that means if you're not going to let it run off into the lake, you have to hold on to it until it can be trucked away, right? You need to put the water somewhere until you can get rid of it. The bridge had always been floating higher than it was designed. It's hollow concrete pontoons, right? If you can have something concrete that floats, it better be hollow. So they had extra flotation in the design of the bridge, and they realized that they would be able to store some water in it until it could be trucked away. They did a lot of really careful calculations and error margins and all of this stuff, so it was not done thoughtlessly. They figured out how much water would not put too much strain on the bridge, and a good pumping schedule and a good trucking schedule and the whole 9 yards. When this happened, no one was on the bridge, no one was injured. It was over the weekend, there was no work. It was during and following a rainstorm, a very windy rainstorm. 1 pontoon sank first, it dragged 7 more down after it. This is a nesting, slow, cascading failure, which I think is super interesting. So this is the shortest number of words that are possible to use to describe what happened to this bridge. The loads that created significant leakage were the combined effects of all accumulations of water, including rain after the windstorm, longitudinal flow on the surface of the bridge, so basically like water on the bridge being blown back and forth by the rain, and pumping both into the bridge and out of it through November 24th, 1990. These loads caused static moments, that's to say pressures, that exceeded the threshold for leakage of the bridge. Existing cracks were opened sufficiently to allow water to leak into the pontoons from the bottom. Progressive and accelerated sinking began at this time. So that was almost a good retrospective, right? Sounded really thorough, lots of factors. Any one of those factors not being there would have meant the bridge didn't sink. But they missed one really huge thing. I read the whole paper, like this is an academic paper. You can get it if you have an affiliation with a university, et cetera. I can give the, so the citation is there at the bottom if you want to take a picture or catch me later. The thing that the investigation missed was that people were having trouble pumping out the water at the rate that the architects and the administrators had set up. So they actually had high and low spots in the bridge, which was putting more strain on the bridge. None of it was exceeding any of the tolerances that the engineers had set up, but overall, they were torquing the bridge, basically, right, by having high and low spots. The investigation noted this and did not indicate that any discussion had gone into finding out why that was. So there's a big human factors problem here. There's a big organizational administration problem here that we are never going to know what that was, but it also directly contributed to what happened to the bridge. The big takeaway from this, if there's one takeaway, which there isn't, but the thing that you could say that would be quick would be complex systems have complex failures. No one human action can be the sole cause of a failure, because they'd been having trouble pumping this bridge out on the right schedule for weeks. It was only until there was a storm and nobody was there that it sank. So if we're going to have a good retrospective, what does that look like? Well, we want to make sure that everyone who needs to be there is present, everyone who was involved in the incident was present. Sorry, this is actually not showing me.
Slide problem?
Yeah, a little bit. Okay, that's good enough. So people forget things. It's what happens. You have life happening, you have personal life, you have work life. That means that we found we need to hold retrospectives within 7 days, 7 actual calendar days of when the incident happened. Day 8, it's useless. Everyone sits there saying, I really feel like I should be able to remember more than this. I'm so sorry. And that's a waste of everyone's time and just makes you feel bad to no useful purpose. So we found 7 days. That's what you need to do in order to hold a useful retrospective. And sometimes with weekends, that's really hard. We have a template that guides people through the retrospective process. It's a Google Doc that has headlines and stuff you fill in and little examples. We try to run a very narrow line between prompting you with enough context clues to make running through the process relatively easy, but not overwhelming you with lots of words in the template. This is something that gets tweaked frequently. We try to make sure that everyone is there. These are high priority meetings. They take precedence over everything else that you might be doing, except for things that can't be moved, like doctor's appointments. But we move everything else, every other meeting that the team has, in order to make this happen. It is really important to get everybody in the room. We often have entire retrospectives go by where the person who is filling the comms role has nothing to say, and they don't say anything, but the one time they speak up is super useful because their role and their perspective is super unique. It is not at all like mine as the incident commander, and it is not at all like that of the engineers who are working on the problem. They're also very useful, since the comms role is filled by support folks, they also have a really good idea of how angry customers were at what happened, which is really useful, right? We might feel like we had a really big impact and a lot of things weren't working for a really long time, but it turns out that the customers who were using those things didn't care that those things weren't working at that time. And other times we think we haven't done too badly and the customers are really upset because it was something that really impacted them a lot. Time of day also plays into that, of course. Total ownership means that usually we have engineering managers running retrospectives for their own teams. So, we have a problem with the routing layer for the public platform, and the team that owns the public platform runs the retrospective internally. They invite us, they invite the comms people, but their manager is responsible for holding it, making sure everyone's present, making sure to collect remediation items. But sometimes you have a really big incident, a really long-running incident, one that a lot of people were involved in, one that was super high profile, any of these things. If you are looking at a retrospective that's going to have 15 people on a Google Hangout, that's going to have an exec in it, that's going to have people who are not used to the retrospective process in it, sometimes you get a lot of benefit from getting an experienced facilitator to run that show. If you are trying to handle a larger number of people, like our retrospectives are usually somewhere in the 4 to 8 person range. So if we're trying to make sure that 15 people all get to say the things that they think need to be said, then you need someone who's really good at asking people to talk and then inviting them to stop. And SRE isn't big enough to do all of these ourselves. That's why the engineering managers do most of them, but we do step in. Some of you may have noticed we had a major billing incident in February. That was not fun. And I ran the retrospective for that because as the person who runs this process, I was the best placed to manage 15 people and an exec. When we're talking in the retrospective about what happened, we're trying to, as an organization, migrate from why questions to how questions. If you ask, why did Courtney break the vase, you're going to get an answer, something like, she tripped and knocked it off the shelf on her way down. And that sounds like Courtney is, maybe needs to go to, I don't know, dance school or something, to figure out where her body is and not break shit.
Human
Courtney,
error.
geez.
It's human error.
Right? Yeah. But if you ask how Courtney broke the vase, you might get a story more like, Courtney tripped on the cat because she didn't have her glasses and didn't see he was there and hit the vase on the way down. It's a much more complex story. There are a lot more things that we can look into there to try to understand how to make this not happen again. But you can also say, how was Courtney able to knock over the vase? In which case, the answer becomes something more like, because she bought earthquake gel, but she hasn't used it yet, because learning how to use a new tool is tiring. It needs some of the better parts of your brain and the better parts of your time, and she's been traveling to conferences and speaking.
So we often hear that something went wrong because of human error. But human error isn't where you end your investigation. It's where you should start your investigation. John Alspaugh, if you're in the audience. Charity reminded us really well yesterday, and so did Amber just a minute ago. People make the best decisions they can with the information they have. Last month in Germany, there was a head-on crash of 2 trains that was attributed to human error. My heart goes out to the victims. 11 people died, 85 injured. My heart also goes out to the controller that made the error. The controller directed 2 trains onto the same track in opposing directions. He tried to warn them when he saw his mistake, but it was too late. That controller is being charged with involuntary manslaughter. The quote is, if he had complied with the rules, there would have been no collision. That's true. But how did that controller make the error? What was going on? What were the surrounding circumstances? Was he working a double shift? Anything like that? What allowed the error to happen? And how did the error take the system down? There was an emergency system on the tracks to brake the trains if they're going in the same direction toward each other. But it had been disabled previously because one of the trains was running late, and they wanted to allow it through. So all of a sudden, we've got this complex situation where far more than human error is going on. And we've got this poor controller that's going to be charged with manslaughter and go to jail for at least 5 years. How long did your human take to notice the error? The controller tried to warn the trains, but he was too late. A human root cause is inhumane. It doesn't take into account how people work. People will make mistakes, especially people that have incomplete information. So we need to design our system to handle this kind of failure. We design our systems to handle failures of, say, a server or 2 or 5. We handle a whole failure of a whole data center. Why don't we handle the failure of a human? We need to make mistakes less easy. We need to find out why the mistake was easy to make. Automation can help us here. We need to expose mistakes early enough that humans can catch them and correct. A few fields have been saying this exact stuff for quite a long time. Medicine, aviation, fire incident response, especially medicine, they're talking about surgical errors and how to reduce them, and they're just going really deep on this stuff. They've been doing it for a long time. I like to read articles on surgical error to try to find out how to make our services more reliable at Heroku. And I steal their best practices while I borrow them. They all agree that the retrospective process must be blameless. Even if it looks like somebody has acted badly, they haven't. They've done their best. Why do we need a blameless retrospective? Blameful retrospectives are a reliability risk. People try to shed blame to avoid repercussions. And that's a reasonable reaction to the system they're in. If you're worried you're going to lose your job, you're not going to be able to feed your kids anymore, and your mortgage is going to get foreclosed on, you're probably going to try to hide that you've made an error if you think that that's going to result in your firing. People withhold information unconsciously. They don't even realize they're doing it. They don't realize that there's more there that they need to share because they're not in an environment where they can share it safely. Engineers must feel safe enough to explain those motivations and decisions that led to the reasonable decision, motivations and factors that led to the reasonable decision that they made that ended up being an error. Remember, we all have the same goal in a post-mortem, a retrospective analysis, improved reliability. So at Heroku, human error is not allowed to be our root cause of a retrospective. Also remember that people who feel like they've made an error are going to self-blame. Don't add more blame to them. I've seen a number of articles lately saying blameless postmortems don't work. It seems to be a trend lately. Bullshit. If your blameless retro process is to sit around a fire singing Kumbaya and avoid mentioning any human actions that led to the impact, of course you're not going to get anywhere. Instead, a blameless retro means that we can talk about human error. We just define human error as a bug in the system or process, and then we fix it. Well, now that we know about this kind of mistake, we can just not do it again, right? So we had a situation where there was a bad push, an engineer went to roll back, standard procedure. They rolled back 100 versions instead of one. Typo. Yeah, it was pretty bad.
That was bad.
That one showed up. You can read the postmortem, try to figure out which one it is. I helped write it. So that's human error, right? That engineer came into the retrospective on the Google Hangout with a label that he had put on his screen that said the root cause, right? It's a joke. But that's not the root cause. How was he able to roll back 100 versions when all he wanted to do was roll back one? Maybe rolling back 100 versions is the correct thing. So maybe not allowing a rollback of 100 is not the right decision, but instead you could warn loudly about it, provide an opportunity for the human to notice that error before it causes user impact. Depending on humans to avoid errors, even errors they've made previously over and over again, is unreasonable, and it's a reliability risk. You're going to have those errors repeat. It's tempting for computer people to consider other humans as substandard computers. They're buggy. They don't do what we tell them to do. Why I told you to do this, no.
They're not reliable. They won't do the same thing over and over again.
We can't get rid of the humans, and we should not try. Humans fill a vital role in our infrastructure. So we should make computers do what they're good at and humans do what they're good at. There are things that humans can do that computers can't do. SRE can help the organization design the process to handle the way that humans work. A human is like any other system in the infrastructure. They're just squishier.
And that vital role that humans fulfill, they built everything. Everything in your infrastructure was built by a human, or many humans, or the collective decisions of humans. Literally everything that exists in your professional life is the way it is because of other people. That means that nothing is immutable, even though it can be sort of hard to change things. And the change that might be the change that you can enact is to leave. Conways Law, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, oh God, I can't see it on the slide. Organizations who design systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structures of these organizations. Do you see the date there? That's 1968. So Conway's Law is something that people have been talking about for a long time. And what it means is that your product, when it goes out, is going to contain all of the rough edges, the disagreements, the disappointments, the frustrations of the humans who made it. And an educated eye can look at your product and see where those things are in your organization. It's a mirror. But what that means, and what we haven't completely started doing as an industry yet, although the talks here this week tell me that we're starting to, we can use that to our advantage. We can apply Conway's Law the other way. We can look at the problems in an organization and try to fix those problems in order to improve the products and the services that we're building. My job is applying Conway's Law in real life, and I love it. All organizations have org charts and hierarchies, but they also have unofficial connections. It pays to have a feeling for interpersonal connections in your organization and to make the effort to maintain your own, the genuine effort, right? This is not about like schmoozing people or whatever. It's making sure that there are people that you connect with in various parts of the org and who feel connected to you so that you can get information that they are not able or comfortable to share in larger groups. They'll come to you and tell you things that are super important that you couldn't have learned any other way. I learned from one of our engineering managers, with whom I have a good rapport, that he doesn't really think that our quarterly planning process is sufficient. And that's not something he's going to say in that way in front of a lot of other people. But we were having a private conversation, and I said, I feel like this belongs in the quarterly planning process. And he said, yeah, but it's not going to go anywhere if it does. I don't even feel like I know how this works. We need to change it, and I don't know what to do. And I was like, thank you, that's really useful. I can take that to my team and we can see if we can do something about this because process is the thing that we do. So gossip, it's really important. And I have connections with certain people across the org. Lex has connections with different people, right? There are different people we connect with in different places, and then if Lex and I can pool the things that we've learned, we can get a really good feeling for who is resentful? Is it because they don't have enough people? Is it because their pager burden is too high? Is it because they don't see where we're going and the relevance of what they're doing to what the company wants to do? And then we can try to fix that. The story I have about this, I worked for the crisis reporting hotline as an undergrad on my college campus. And that hotline had a policy that I haven't seen before or since, which is that we invited you to call us for anything. Anytime, we were open 24 hours a day. If you wanted to ask us trivia questions, this was in the baby days of Alta Vista. So if you wanted to ask us trivia questions, because there wasn't any Google, if you wanted to ask us for judicious help on your homework, if you just wanted to chat, if you needed somebody to settle an argument at a party, you could call us. And the idea was that we wanted you to have the experience of picking up the phone and dialing that number and knowing that whoever you got on the other end was going to treat you like a person and treat whatever you were asking about seriously and not laugh at you, so that when you were in crisis, dealing with something you didn't know how to handle, you would have already done that and you would have the assurance that you'd get the same treatment from us again. That's what this is. Making sure that you have a good rapport with people across your organization so that when they have something that they don't know what to do about and they need to get it off their chest, there's a chance you'll hear about it. Everything in your organization was made by people. That means that everything was a people problem. Everything is a people problem. Figure out how to love and support your people, and that way we can all make better products and, honestly, have a better life at the office.
And the total ownership model is how we do that. And we feel like it's awesome. And total ownership model plus SRE equals love. Thanks for listening. We'd rather not do Q&A. We'd rather have one-on-one conversations. So please, we'll be out in the hall. Also, I just started SRE Weekly in November. Subscribe. Thank you.
It's a mailing list. He forgets to say that.
Yeah, it's a newsletter.